If you walk into the highlands of western Georgia, near the mouth of the Black Sea, you can find a limestone cavern called Zudzuana. In the 1990s, archaeologists from the Georgian National Museum and the University of Pennsylvania sifted through its Paleolithic layers. What they found were not tools of stone or bone, but tiny fibers of flax twisted together. Radiocarbon dating placed them at roughly 34,000 years before present, by far the oldest evidence of spun thread ever discovered. Each filament had been plied by hand, showing deliberate twisting, and several were dyed with pigments, reds, blacks, even turquoise, suggesting a taste for color long before written language. These were not scraps from clothing, but fragments of cordage, string made to bind, tie, carry, and fasten. It marked a leap in cognition. Thread allowed humans to join materials that were separate, to make containers, nets, and slings, technologies that multiplied strength and reach. Across the Pleistocene world, people began doing much the same thing. In Israel's Ohalo II site, 19,000 years old, impressions of twisted fibers appear on clay. In the Czech Republic's Pavlov Hills, small fired figurines preserve the imprint of woven cords that once held them during shaping. The pattern repeats from Africa to the Arctic. Twisting fibers became a human universal. The earliest textiles were not woven on looms. They were plaited or twined by hand, sometimes with reeds, sometimes with grasses, sinew, or bast fiber, the inner bark of trees, such as lime or willow. These flexible strands could form mats, baskets, fishing nets, and belts. The principle was tension. One set of fibers held taut, while another passed around or through it. Wherever people learned to maintain that tension between threads, they were on the threshold of weaving. The next documented step appears in the Neolithic, roughly 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, when settled villages replaced nomadic camps. With agriculture came time and stability enough to refine fiber plants. Flax in the Near East, hemp in Central Asia, and rami in China were cultivated as purpose crops. Archaeologists at Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia occupied around 7,400 to 6,200 BCE, found impressions of woven fabric on fragments of clay plaster and a number of small, perforated clay discs interpreted as loom weights. Their presence shows that by this period, people were using a warp-weighted loom, a wooden frame where vertical warp threads hung under the pull of those weights, while the horizontal weft was passed through with a shuttle or stick. Such looms were simple but effective. The weaver could control pattern by changing which warp threads were lifted or separated, a forerunner of all later textile mechanics. In the damp soil of Switzerland's lakeside settlements, dating to about 5000 BCE, archaeologists have recovered preserved fragments of woven linen so fine that individual threads measure less than a millimeter thick. These were the first true cloths, made not for trapping or carrying, but for covering the human body. Once cloth could be produced in quantity, it entered the record of trade. From the Ubaid period in southern Mesopotamia, 5,300 to 4,000 BCE, come clay seal impressions showing bundles of textiles as trade goods. By the Uruk period, around 3,200 BCE, temple workshops at cities such as Ur and Lagash were employing large numbers of women as weavers. Cuneiform tablets list allocations of wool, rations of barley, and finished output. These are the world's first surviving administrative documents, and they revolve around textiles. One tablet records 60 minas of wool issued to the weavers of the goddess Inanna, a precise account of labor, material, and yield. In other words, the first bookkeeping was industrial accounting for cloth. The choice of fiber reflected local ecology. Mesopotamia, with its dry heat, favored sheep wool over flax. Egypt, nourished by the Nile's water, grew flax in abundance and spun it into linen of extraordinary fineness. Samples from First Dynasty tombs, around 3000 BCE, have as many as 80 threads per centimeter, a count that Europe would not equal until modern mechanized spinning. Egyptian wall paintings from Thebes and Beni Hassan show horizontal ground looms operated by teams of women, their work rhythmically coordinated. Linen was used for garments, sails, household cloth, and mummification wrappings, hundreds of meters per royal burial. The goddess Ninth, patron of weaving and war, embodied that dual symbolism: creation and order, drawn from chaos. Everywhere the loom appeared, it reorganized life. It required stationary architecture to support the frame, steady light, and reliable supply of fiber. That meant domestic workshops, family labor, apprenticeship, and division of tasks: spinning, dyeing, weaving, finishing. Archaeological residues, spindle whorls, loom weights, and dye vats appear together wherever permanent settlement took hold. The loom thus ranks with the plow and the potter's wheel as a defining tool of the early village economy. By 3000 BCE, textiles were already serving as currency and tribute. In Mesopotamia, cloth was issued to officials as pay. In Egypt, bolts of linen formed part of tax assessments. In the Andes of South America, independent of the Old World, cotton and camelid wool were woven on backstrap looms, likewise serving as units of wealth. The technology had crossed oceans and environments without contact, because the logic of weaving is as universal as counting. By the dawn of recorded history, human beings had mastered the principle that a single thread, held in tension and crossed by another, could produce order, strength, and pattern. From that principle would grow economies, empires, and eventually machines. But at Çatalhöyük, in those smoke-blackened houses of mud brick, it was still just hands, fibers, and time. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, cloth had become a state concern. On the floodplains of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates met, the great temples of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash ran what can only be called textile factories. Clay tablets from the archives of the goddess Inanna's temple record teams of women, sometimes hundreds, receiving monthly rations of barley and oil in exchange for their labor. The entries are dry: 10 gore of barley to the spinners, 60 minas of wool to the weavers of Inanna, but they amount to the first surviving payrolls in history. In these workshops, spinning and weaving were standardized, measured, and supervised. The output clothed priests, soldiers, and bureaucrats. It was traded to distant cities for copper and timber. In a real sense, the first bureaucracies ran on thread. North along the Nile, another civilization had made cloth almost a theology. Egypt's climate favored flax, whose long, smooth fibers could be spun into linen of unmatched fineness. Archaeologists have unrolled bolts from tombs in which individual threads number more than 80 per centimeter. The weavers appear again and again in tomb paintings, women seated before ground looms, passing the shuttle by hand, while assistants wind bobbins or beat the weft with bone combs. Linen there was both everyday fabric and sacred material. It wrapped offerings, shrouded mummies, and lined temples. The goddess Neith, revered since the earliest dynasties, was said to have woven the world at creation. Her emblem was the loom's shuttle. The value Egyptians placed on cloth can still be read in their accounting. In the reign of Ramses III, 12th century BCE, temple records list more than 200,000 garments distributed as pay to workmen and priests. Linen was property. Bolts were taxed, stored, and inherited. When Greek visitors later wrote of Egyptian cleanliness, the daily change of linen, they were describing a society where weaving had become both economy and identity. Across the Mediterranean, the Minoans and Mycenaeans left the same traces: spindle whorls, loom weights, and seal stones engraved with patterns echoing woven designs. In Homer's Odyssey, composed centuries later but remembering the Bronze Age world, Penelope's loom becomes the symbol of order itself, work done and undone to preserve a household. The audience needed no explanation. In every Greek home, weaving defined domestic virtue. Women spun wool as they talked. Girls learned to handle the spindle almost as soon as they could walk. A bride's dowry was measured as much in the cloth she had woven as in coin or land. Even philosophy borrowed the metaphor. Plato, in The Statesman, wrote that the good ruler weaves together the temperate and the brave to make harmony in the state. For the Greeks, to weave was to govern wisely. Far to the east, in the valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, a different fiber had transformed daily life. Chinese legend tells of Empress Leizu, wife of the Yellow Emperor, who around 2700 BCE noticed a silkworm cocoon fall into her tea and, drawing it out, discovered that it could be unwound into a single filament. The story is myth, but archaeology confirms the practice it describes. By the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE, silk thread and woven fragments appear in tombs at Anyang. By the time of the Zhou, China had developed the draw loom, a complex apparatus of pulleys and cords that let an assistant lift selected warps while the main weaver passed the shuttle, making patterned brocades centuries before anything comparable in the West. Silk was light, strong, and lustrous. It became both a commodity and a state monopoly. The Zhou government regulated mulberry cultivation and silk production. Bolts of cloth served as taxes and rewards. Chinese silk traveled first within Asia, to Korea and Central Asia, and, in small quantities, westward. Actual strands of Chinese silk have been found in Scythian graves in Siberia, dating to the 5th century BCE, the earliest proof that the fabric had begun its long journey toward Europe. Larger trade would come later, under the Han, but the route had opened. Meanwhile, the great empires of the Near East, Assyria, Babylonia, and later Persia, made textiles a tool of diplomacy. Tribute lists from Assyrian kings mention dyed woolen garments of many colors, and Persian reliefs at Persepolis show subject peoples presenting cloth as gifts to the Achaemenid court. Dyes were traded as fiercely as the cloth itself. Madder from Anatolia, indigo from India, Tyrian purple from the Levant, pressed from murex shells at a cost that made the color worth its weight in silver. By the 6th century BCE, the Mediterranean world was alive with textile production. Phoenician traders carried dyed cloth from the Levant. Greek and Etruscan workshops copied Eastern patterns. When Herodotus described the wealth of Lydia or Babylon, he described it in fabric, embroidered robes, patterned draperies, hangings of dyed wool. The loom had become a universal instrument of power. Temples ran it, palaces displayed it, merchants lived by it. Across these thousands of miles and 3 millennia, the evidence, tablets, tombs, murals, and cloth itself traces the same arc. Wherever humans sought permanence, they reached for thread. The loom, once a household tool, had become the infrastructure of civilization. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, weaving had become a mirror of empire itself, vast, hierarchical, and carefully organized. In the Near East, the Achaemenid Persians maintained state textile workshops at Susa and Persepolis, employing spinners and dyers from across their conquered provinces. Reliefs carved into the palace stairways show delegations bringing tribute: horses, gold, and, always, bolts of patterned cloth. When Alexander's army seized those palaces in 330 BCE, Greek chroniclers wrote that the treasure included robes of purple and scarlet, stored for 200 years. Fabric had become a unit of imperial wealth, measured in centuries. In the Mediterranean, Rome built its own textile economy on the back of wool. Flocks grazed from Hispania to Syria, and in the cities, fullers' workshops, the Phaloniki, cleaned and finished the cloth. Excavations at Pompeii's Phalonica of Stephanus preserve its basins and treading floors. Slaves and freedmen stamping wool in a mixture of water and alkaline solution, often urine, to scour grease from the fibers. The cloth was rinsed, brushed, stretched on wooden frames, and pressed between stone slabs. The process left a stench that Roman writers joked about, but it produced a fabric prized across the empire. From the Latin textus, meaning that which is woven, come our words text, texture, and context, a linguistic legacy of the Roman workshop. The empire's appetite for finery reached eastward. Chinese silk, reaching Mediterranean ports through intermediaries, became a craze among Rome's elite. Pliny the Elder complained that the wealth of our empire is being drained by the purchase of silk for our women. In 14 CE, the Senate even tried to restrict its import, calling the translucent fabric immoral. The ban failed. Silk continued to arrive, through Parthian merchants and Indian seafarers, at ports like Alexandria and Antioch. By the 1st century CE, Rome's emperors were paying for Eastern luxury with silver coin on an industrial scale, the earliest record of a global trade imbalance. When the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, weaving did not. In Byzantium, the eastern remnant of Rome, silk became a state monopoly. The historian Procopius recounts how, in the 6th century, 2 monks smuggled silkworm eggs from China concealed in bamboo rods, an episode that, whether embellished or not, marks the transfer of sericulture westward. Soon imperial workshops in Constantinople, Thebes, and Antioch were producing their own brocades, gold-threaded silks whose motifs of eagles, vines, and saints reflected Christian theology. Surviving fragments in museums today still carry traces of gilt thread. These textiles served as both vestments and diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors received them as proof of imperial favor, and bishops wore them as visible theology. Farther east, under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, China's draw looms reached new complexity. Pattern registers with hundreds of levers allowed weavers to create landscapes, clouds, and calligraphic designs. The Tang Shu, a court chronicle, records entire government bureaus devoted to dye chemistry and weave design. Silk was currency, bureaucracy, and high art at once. Across the Islamic world, from Spain to Persia, textiles carried the very language of power. The Caliphal Taraz system, embroidery workshops attached to royal courts, produced garments bearing woven or stitched inscriptions praising God and ruler. Surviving examples from Egypt and Yemen show Kufic lettering running along cuffs and hems, the words acting as both ornament and political statement. In markets from Baghdad to Cairo, merchants traded cottons and silks dyed with indigo, madder, and saffron. Their techniques spread west with the expansion of Islam. By the 10th century, the horizontal treadle loom, which freed a weaver's hands by using foot pedals to lift warps, was common in the Middle East, a key innovation that would later transform European production. When Muslim artisans crossed into Iberia in the 8th century, they brought those technologies with them. In Al-Andalus, cities such as Córdoba and Almeria produced silks patterned with interlaced stars and geometric borders, the textile counterpart to the arches of the Great Mosque. Even after Christian conquest, these Moorish looms remained in use. The new rulers simply rebranded their products as granadinas or valencianas. Techniques, like dyes, ignored political boundaries. In Western and Northern Europe, the center of gravity remained wool. The damp pastures of England and Flanders yielded dense fleeces perfect for cloth. Monasteries at places like Cluny and York managed herds and weaving rooms, integrating textile work into their religious discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict, idleness is the enemy of the soul, encouraged manual labor, and spinning and weaving fit that ethos exactly. In these centuries of shifting kingdoms, the monastery was the closest thing to an industrial plant, its productivity measured in yards of undyed wool. By the 10th century, towns such as Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges were exporting finished cloth across the Channel. Records from English ports mention ships laden with Flemish broadcloth as early as the 11th century. The prophets financed cathedrals and civic walls. The weavers organized themselves into guilds, early associations that set standards for thread count and dye quality. A bolt of cloth stamped with a city's seal guaranteed both craftsmanship and honesty. Meanwhile, in the cold north, the tradition of the warp-weighted loom persisted. Excavations in Viking settlements from Norway to Iceland show loom weights in nearly every longhouse. The fabric they produced, vadmal, a dense woolen twill, was used as currency, its value fixed by law in the Icelandic Gragas Code. A debt might be settled with 3 ells of good wadmal, each ell about 50 centimeters. In those economies, weaving was not a metaphor for wealth. It was wealth. Across the Atlantic world of the Andes, unconnected to Eurasia, Andean cultures such as the Nazca and Paracas were simultaneously perfecting backstrap looms that produced textiles of breathtaking intricacy. Wool from alpaca and vicuña, dyed with cochineal and plant extracts, created images so detailed that archaeologists today analyze them as we might analyze writing. The tools were different, but the intellectual achievement was parallel. By 1200 CE, the known world had become a patchwork of specialized textile regions. Chinese silks, Persian brocades, Egyptian linens, West African strip-woven cottons, Andean camelid cloths, and European wools. Each carried centuries of local knowledge, fiber preparation, dye chemistry, pattern systems, yet all were bound by the same physical logic: warp and weft under tension. In monasteries, markets, and royal courts alike, the loom remained the quiet engine of prosperity. It had outlasted empires and crossed faiths. It linked the monk at his frame in Burgundy to the artisan at his draw loom in Hangzhou, and the weaver in Cordoba tracing kufic letters into silk. Civilization's map could now be read in fabric. By the 13th century, weaving in Europe had moved from monastery and cottage to town and guild hall. The guilds of Flanders and northern France were the most powerful labor organizations of the Middle Ages. In Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, the Weavers' Guild could shut a city down. They regulated apprenticeship, usually 7 years, fixed prices, controlled exports, and inspected every bolt before it left the market. Inspectors pressed a lead seal into approved cloth, a mark of civic trust as binding as coin. The reason was simple. Cloth was Europe's most valuable manufactured good. English wool, dense and greasy from the island's damp pastures, was the raw material of choice. Fleeces were exported by the shipload to the weavers of Flanders and Italy. The English crown taxed every sack. A levy called the Great Custom Kings financed wars on that revenue. The medieval slogan, "The sheep's back built England," was no exaggeration. In those Flemish towns, the industry fed an entire social order. Spinners, fullers, dyers, shearers, and merchants filled narrow streets that still bear their names: Volderstraat, Vollestraat. The sound of hammers and fulling stocks beating wet cloth echoed day and night. In the 13th century, Bruges' cloth exports equaled the output of all England's mines. The economic historian John Munro calls it Europe's first industrial complex. To the south, Italy had found its own specialty: silk. By the 12th century, the skills first imported from Byzantium and the Islamic world had taken root in cities like Lucca, Venice, and Florence. The Italian silk weavers perfected the draw loom, using a draw buoy atop the frame to raise selected warps through cords and pulleys, allowing complex patterns of gold and colored threads. Surviving account books from Lucca list hundreds of active looms in the 1200s, each employing an extended family. The trade was lucrative enough that the city council forbade the immigration of master weavers, treating their knowledge as a state secret. Venice became the hub. Its merchants imported raw silk from Syria and Sicily, dyestuffs from Anatolia, and fine alum, a mordant that fixed color, from the Aegean islands. By the 15th century, Venetian velvets, heavy with gold brocade, were Europe's costliest fabrics. A single robe could cost more than a laborer's lifetime earnings. In portraits by Bellini and Titian, the texture you see, the sheen of sleeve and hem, is documentary, a record of a booming textile economy. The guild system governed not only labor, but quality. In Florence, the Arte della Lana, wool guild, and the Arte della Seda, silk guild, wielded political power equal to that of bankers. Their halls still stand, their statutes preserved, rules on loom width, dye mixtures, minimum thread counts. When merchants failed, guilds acted as insurers. When governments faltered, they provided credit. The wealth from textiles financed much of the Renaissance. The Medici fortune began in the wool trade before moving into banking and art patronage. While Italy refined silk and Flanders mastered wool, the Islamic world continued to supply cotton, the most adaptable of fibers. Cultivated from Egypt to India, cotton reached Europe by way of Muslim Spain and the Crusader ports. The word muslin comes from Mosul in Iraq, where travelers first encountered the fine Indian fabrics. Calico comes from Calicut, on India's Malabar coast. These eastern textiles astonished Europeans for their lightness and brilliant printed dyes. Long before the voyages of discovery, Indian artisans in Gujarat and Coromandel were block printing cottons with resist dyes that kept their color for decades. The Mongol Empire, brutal in conquest but open in commerce, joined these worlds together. By the late 13th century, the Silk Road stretched unbroken from the Mediterranean to China. Venetian merchants, among them Marco Polo, traveled its length. In his account of the court of Kublai Khan, Polo described cloth of gold and silk so rich that nothing like it is made anywhere else in the world. The trade did not just move fabric, it moved design. Chinese cloud motifs appeared in Persian carpets. Islamic geometries re-emerged in Italian brocades. The loom had become a conduit for ideas. In Iberia, the Nasrid kingdom of Granada wove silks patterned with arabesques and Kufic calligraphy. Even after the Reconquista in 1492, Christian rulers kept Muslim artisans at work under royal protection, their skill irreplaceable. Many of the sumptuous vestments preserved in Spanish cathedrals today were woven by those same hands. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, new guild cities rose. London's Cloth Workers' Company, founded in 1528, codified the finishing of broadcloth, fulling, tentering, shearing, dyeing, pressing. English cloth became the backbone of Tudor exports. Parliament prohibited the export of unfinished wool, forcing foreigners to buy the finished product, a mercantilist policy that turned England from a supplier of fleece into a manufacturer of wealth. When Elizabeth I posed for her coronation portrait in 1559, wearing a gown of English velvet, it was as much an economic statement as a fashion choice. By the end of the 16th century, the textile world was global in scope. Portuguese and Spanish ships carried silks from China and cottons from India around Africa's Cape and across the Atlantic. Flemish and Italian merchants financed expeditions in cloth as others did in silver. Even the first English voyages to America included weavers and fullers among their settlers. Fabric was civilization's kit. The interlacing of these trades built the first sustained world economy. European looms depended on Asian silk and Indian cotton. Eastern dyers sought European alum and tin. African traders exchanged gold and slaves for cloth. By 1600, cloth accounted for more than half of Europe's exports by value. It was light, durable, and universally desired, an ideal currency in motion. The medieval loom had already become a machine of remarkable sophistication. In Florence, workshops wove damasks with 2 shuttles. In Lyon and Granada, multiple-colored draw looms created brocades rivaling paintings, but the pace of human hands was reaching its limit. Every advance in trade demanded an advance in production. Somewhere in the turning of those wheels, a new question was beginning to stir. Could motion itself be woven? That question would define the next era. At the opening of the 17th century, Europe was still clothed in wool, silk, and linen. Cotton existed at the margins, an import from the East. What changed everything was the Indian cotton industry, by then already ancient. In Gujarat and on India's Coromandel coast, spinners using the simple charkha wheel and weavers working pit looms produced cloth so fine that entire bales could pass through a man's ring. The English East India Company began importing those fabrics in the 1600s, plain muslins from Bengal, printed calicos from Calicut. They were lighter, softer, and easier to wash than anything Europe made. Demand soared. By the 1680s, London merchants were selling Indian cotton by the shipload, alarming domestic producers. Wool weavers petitioned Parliament, arguing that the trade would utterly ruin English industry. The government responded with 2 bans. In 1700, a prohibition on the import of printed calicos. In 1721, a ban on their sale. Neither worked. Smugglers kept the fashion alive, and soon English manufacturers began attempting to spin and weave cotton themselves. Cotton had one great technical obstacle. Unlike wool or flax, its staple fibers are short. Hand spinners could not draw them into a thread strong enough for warp. For decades, British weavers used imported Indian yarn or mixed cotton with linen. Then, in 1764, a Lancashire weaver named James Hargreaves built the spinning jenny, a wooden frame that let one worker draw 8 threads at once by turning a single wheel. A few years later, Richard Arkwright, a barber turned entrepreneur, patented the water frame, powered by a water wheel. It produced stronger, more uniform yarn, suitable for warp. Factories rose along fast rivers in Derbyshire and Lancashire. Arkwright's Cromford Mill, 1771, is often called the first modern factory. 3 stories of brick and timber filled with the whir of hundreds of spindles. The invention race quickened. Samuel Crompton's mule, 1779, combined Hargreaves's and Arkwright's principles, producing fine thread in bulk. Within a generation, the cottage spinner was obsolete. Families who had worked at home for centuries found themselves forced into the mills. Production multiplied 100-fold, and prices collapsed. Cotton, once a luxury, became the fabric of the common shirt. But weaving still lagged behind spinning. Each loom had to be operated by hand. In 1785, a country parson, Edmund Cartwright, patented the power loom, driven by steam. His first machines were unreliable, but the principle was sound. By 1800, there were more than 2,000 power looms in Britain. By 1820, over 100,000. The rhythmic clatter of their shuttles filled entire towns: Manchester, Oldham, Bolton, Leeds, earning Lancashire its nickname, the workshop of the world. The transformation was not confined to Britain. In Lowell, Massachusetts, a planned mill town founded in the 1820s, investors copied the British model, harnessing the Merrimack River to drive great brick mills. Young women from New England farms, the Lowell Mill Girls, lived in supervised boarding houses and worked 12-hour shifts at the looms. Their letters and diaries, preserved today, form the first body of industrial labor writing in America. Industrialization reordered life itself. Work, once governed by daylight and season, was now ruled by the factory bell. Time was measured by the clock, not the sun. Families were divided by function. Men in foundries, women and children in textile sheds. The economic gains were real, the human cost immense. In 1811 to 1813, groups of displaced weavers calling themselves Luddites, after a symbolic figure, Ned Ludd, broke into mills and smashed machines. Their protests were suppressed by force. Parliament made frame breaking a capital crime, but their despair was prophetic. The machine had changed the meaning of labor. In France, the shift came in silk. Lyon had long been Europe's silk capital, its K-nuts, silk weavers, working at hand looms in cramped workshops. In 1804, Joseph Marie Jacquard unveiled a device that automated pattern control using punched cards linked in chains. Each hole corresponded to a raised warp thread. The absence of a hole meant it stayed down. The loom could reproduce any design, flowers, scrolls, even portraits, with perfect regularity. Productivity soared, wages fell, and in 1831, the Canuts rose in revolt under black flags inscribed Vivre en travaillant ou mourir en combattant, live working or die fighting. The French army crushed them, but their machine endured. The Jacquard loom would later inspire the earliest computers. Across the Atlantic, another machine deepened the story's shadow. In 1793, the American inventor Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, a simple hand-cranked device that separated seeds from fiber. It made cotton cultivation vastly more profitable and cemented the system of slavery in the American South. By 1850, the United States supplied 3/4 of the world's raw cotton. Bales harvested by enslaved Africans and African Americans were shipped to Liverpool and Manchester, where they fed the power looms of Europe. The global economy of cloth was also an economy of bondage. Observers grasped the paradox. In 1819, the poet William Blake called England's new factories dark satanic mills. Yet others saw them as triumphs of order and progress. Visitors compared the mills to cathedrals, high windows admitting pale light, iron beams humming with motion. The textile mill had become the symbol of the Industrial Revolution, the first place where power, labor, and capital met under one roof. By the middle of the 19th century, textiles were the largest industry on Earth. They accounted for more than half of Britain's exports, financed the railway boom, and provided the model for factory organization everywhere else. The same principles, division of labor, mechanized power, precision parts, soon appeared in printing, metallurgy, and shipbuilding. The loom had taught humanity how to build machines that imitated human rhythm. Yet in corners of every industrial nation, the old craft survived. In the cottages of Ireland and the Highlands, in the workshops of Lyon and Kyoto, hand weavers still worked by lamplight, their shuttles moving with deliberate grace. They were out of step with their age, but they kept alive the memory of what weaving had once meant, the alignment of hand, eye, and patience. The thread that had begun in the Paleolithic cave of Zuzwana now spanned oceans, linked continents, and bound millions of lives. It had created fortunes and misery in equal measure, and unseen by almost everyone, it had prepared the intellectual ground for the next revolution, the one in which the loom would teach machines not just to move, but to think. By the middle of the 19th century, the sound of the loom was the pulse of the modern world. From the cotton towns of Lancashire to the mill cities of New England, factory whistles measured the day. In Manchester alone, there were more than 100,000 power looms in operation by 1850, fed by raw cotton shipped from ports in New Orleans, Charleston, and Bombay. The global weave was literal. Bales marked Mississippi, arriving in Liverpool, woven cloth leaving for Calcutta or Cape Town. Textiles did not just build the industrial economy, they created its logic. The factory system, perfected first in cotton mills, spread outward to other trades. Precision parts, time discipline, and hierarchical supervision, the essential features of modern industry, were first worked out in the counting houses and weaving sheds of northern England. The historian Alfred Chandler later called textiles the prototype of the modern business enterprise. Inside the mills, technology advanced as relentlessly as commerce. By the 1850s, steam power had replaced water almost entirely. Iron looms, stronger and faster than wood, could run day and night. The shuttle flew so quickly that workers called it the devil's bird. Entire communities grew up around this rhythm. In Oldham or Bolton, a child might enter the spinning room at age 9 and retire at 50 without ever having left the mill floor. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the Lowell system matured into a nationwide industry. Southern mills began to rival the North, feeding on local cotton. In the post-Civil War era, places like Augusta, Georgia, and Spartanburg, South Carolina, built vast complexes modeled on New England's. The ironies were inescapable. The same fiber that had once enslaved millions now powered the South's reconstruction. While cotton and wool ruled the factories, silk remained the fabric of innovation. In Lyon, Bologna, and Krefeld, the jacquard loom, introduced half a century earlier, became standard equipment. Each loom carried a long chain of punched cards, each card a precise sequence of holes. The pattern of holes dictated which warp threads lifted on each pass of the shuttle. It was a mechanical memory, storing design as data. Engineers recognized the principle's potential. In the 1830s, the English mathematician Charles Babbage began designing what he called the analytical engine, a general-purpose calculating machine. His collaborator, Ada Lovelace, saw the connection immediately. "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns," she wrote, just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. Her sentence would later be recognized as the first description of programmable computation. Babbage's machine was never completed, but the metaphor endured. Throughout the century, inventors borrowed from the loom's logic: sequence, repetition, and control. The player piano, the telegraph relay, even the typewriter all echoed Jacquard's system of mechanical encoding. The loom had become a way of thinking. The second half of the century brought new materials. In 1884, the French chemist Hilaire de Chardonnay created artificial silk by dissolving cellulose and extruding it into filaments. He called it rayon, the first synthetic fiber. It was flammable and imperfect, but it marked the beginning of textile chemistry. 50 years later, in 1935, DuPont chemists in Delaware produced nylon, spun not from plants or animals, but from coal, air, and water. The announcement caused a sensation. When nylon stockings reached the market in 1940, they sold 4 million pairs in 4 days. Humanity had created thread from molecules. Yet even as chemistry changed the substance of cloth, the structure of the textile world remained familiar: mills, machines, and labor. In Europe and America, women made up the majority of textile workers. In the 1880s, reformers like Florence Kelley and Jane Addams investigated the conditions of tenement sweatshops in New York and Chicago, where immigrant families worked treadle machines for pennies a day. The fight for labor rights in the textile industry would lead directly to the early union movement, and later to the creation of child labor laws. Machines, meanwhile, were learning to calculate. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau faced a daunting task, counting 62 million citizens. A young engineer named Herman Hollerith devised a solution. He borrowed the Jacquard principle. Each census sheet was translated into a punch card, a rectangle of stiff paper with holes representing yes or no answers. A tabulating machine read those holes with metal pins and electrical contacts. The new system reduced the census processing time from 8 years to 1. Hollerith's company would later become IBM. Once again, the loom had provided the template for a new kind of machine. By the turn of the 20th century, textiles had also transformed global trade. The same steamships that carried cotton and wool now carried finished goods to every port. The British Empire's cloth industry employed millions, from spinners in Manchester to dyers in Bombay and weavers in Shanghai. By 1910, India exported over 800 million yards of cotton cloth annually, much of it woven in British-owned mills on Indian soil. Mahatma Gandhi's later campaign for Swadeshi, or self-spinning, was not romanticism. It was a direct challenge to that imperial system. World wars turned textiles into strategic materials. During the First World War, women in Britain and America knit socks and bandages by the million. Soldiers' uniforms consumed mountains of wool. In the Second World War, nylon replaced silk in parachutes and tires, freeing silk for medical sutures. The U.S. government requisitioned 80% of national nylon production in 1942. The age of synthetic fiber had arrived. By mid-century, the rhythm of the old mill towns was fading. Steam gave way to electricity. New mills rose in Japan, India, and China, where labor was cheaper. In Europe and America, textile districts hollowed out, but the technology they had pioneered had already leapt into another domain. In 1944, engineers working on early computers described their memory systems in textile terms: weaving circuits, threads of execution. The vocabulary of weaving had become the language of computation. A century after Lovelace, the metaphor she coined was no longer metaphor. The logic of the loom had entered the logic of the machine. When the Second World War ended, the great mill towns of Britain, New England, and northern France were already past their prime. Their brick chimneys still smoked, but competition was shifting east. Labor costs in Europe and the United States had climbed. Japan, newly rebuilt and equipped with modern machinery, became the first post-war textile power. By 1955, Japanese mills produced more cloth than all of Britain's. Within another generation, production had moved again to Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and eventually mainland China. The transfer was not accidental. International agencies such as the World Bank and the IMF encouraged developing nations to build export industries, and textiles were the easiest to start. Inexpensive machinery, abundant labor, steady demand. In the 1970s, new industrial parks rose along the Pearl River Delta and in South India's Coimbatore region. By 2000, China alone was exporting more textiles than the entire world had in 1950. The same thread that had once tied Manchester to Mississippi now stretched from Guangdong to Los Angeles. At the same time, chemistry remade the fabric itself. The promise of nylon had drawn a whole generation of synthetic research. DuPont's polyester, introduced commercially in 1953 as Dacron, resisted wrinkles and dried overnight. Acrylic imitated wool. Spandex, developed in 1958, stretched without losing shape. By the 1970s, synthetics accounted for more than half of global fiber production. Cotton remained king in comfort, but polyester ruled the market. Humanity, for the first time, wore materials that had never grown. Automation transformed the loom again. Airjet and waterjet looms, first commercialized in the 1950s and 60s, replaced the flying shuttle with a pulse of compressed air, or water, that could shoot the weft across the warp at hundreds of picks per minute. Microprocessors took over pattern control. In a modern weaving hall, the human ear hears not the clack of wood, but a steady mechanical hiss. Sensors watch tension and breakage. Computers store entire designs. A 21st century factory can produce in a day what once required a medieval town. The social map of production changed accordingly. By the 1980s, most consumer textiles sold in the West were made abroad. The label Made in Hong Kong gave way to Made in China, then Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ethiopia. The 2013 Rana Plaza collapse in Dhaka, which killed more than 1,100 garment workers, revealed the human cost of this system, an echo of the 19th century mills that had started it. The textile industry remained a measure of global inequality. High technology at the top, manual labor at the base, linked by supply chains as intricate as any weave. Yet even as manufacturing dispersed, craft persisted. In Kyoto, masters of Nishijin ori brocade still work looms modeled on 16th century designs. In the Andes, Quechua and Aymara weavers pass down patterns older than the Inca Empire, their symbolism studied by anthropologists as a living language. In Appalachia, small studios revived hand-weaving as art. These continuities remind us that the loom was never merely a machine. It was, and remains, a system of knowledge. Meanwhile, the logic of weaving migrated fully into technology. In the 1950s, computer engineers adopted terms that would have been clear to any weaver: threads, fabric, networks. The first magnetic core memories were literally woven, tiny ferrite rings laced with copper wires by the thousands, mostly by women trained in textile work. Each crossing of wire and core stored a single bit. Warp and weft turned into ones and zeros. The lineage from the Jacquard cards to IBM's punched cards, and from there to the integrated circuit, is unbroken. By the end of the 20th century, another kind of fabric had appeared: the digital web. The internet's architecture borrowed the same metaphors: nodes, meshes, interlacing connections. Engineers spoke of network topology and information bandwidth, words drawn unconsciously from looms and threads. The textile had become virtual, but its principle was identical: order through interconnection. Environmental awareness brought the story full circle. Synthetics that once symbolized progress became sources of microplastic pollution. Cotton's thirst for water and pesticides raised new concerns. Researchers turned back to the laboratory, this time to bio-based fibers. Lyocell, spun from wood pulp, bamboo viscose, and experimental textiles grown from algae or bacteria. The 21st century challenge is the same one that faced Neolithic spinners: how to make strong, beautiful thread without exhausting the materials that supply it. Walk into a modern weaving plant today, and the lineage is visible. Aluminum frames have replaced wood. Lasers and air jets have replaced shuttles. Yet in one corner, almost always, a worker has pinned an old shuttle to the wall. It is not superstition. It is memory. Because the people who tend these machines know that every pattern, however complex, begins with the same act. One thread held taut, another passed through, again and again, until meaning appears. Across 40,000 years, that act has linked Paleolithic caves to power looms, Jacquard cards to computers, cotton fields to the circuits of global trade. The forms have changed, the rhythm endures. The loom taught us not only how to clothe the body, but how to think in patterns, to see structure and repetition, connection and difference. The world today is covered in fabrics: cotton, polyester, glass fiber, carbon fiber, and the invisible threads of data streaming through the air. Each carries the same ancestry. From flax twisted in a Georgian cave to the cables that bind continents, the thread has never broken. So if you were to stand anywhere in the modern world, on a city street, in a laboratory, before a computer screen, and you are surrounded by the descendants of that first thread. The cords that lace our shoes, the fibers that bind concrete, the wires that carry light. Everywhere you look, the old idea endures: that strength lies not in a single strand, but in what we join together. For 40,000 years, weaving has been a quiet constant. It outlasted kingdoms and empires, belief systems and machines. It bound the earliest huts and sails, dressed pharaohs and monks, clothed soldiers and astronauts. Each generation added its own rhythm, its own material, its own meaning. The loom became a teacher. From it we learned proportion, repetition, and tension held in balance. we learned that pattern is the visible form of patience. When we built machines to think, we borrowed the loom's language, threads, networks, memory. When we built the world economy, we followed its logic of interdependence. And when we speak now of a social fabric or a web of life, we are speaking in metaphors spun long before language had a script. Civilization has always been a tangle of loose ends, ambition, necessity, invention, but weaving turned those threads into order. It trained the human hand to shape the world by steady motion rather than force. The loom, in that sense, is a record of temperament as much as technology. It tells us that what endures is rarely the sudden breakthrough, but the repeated act. The shuttle's pass, the patient knot, the willingness to repair. If the noise of industry has softened, the rhythm has not stopped. It hums now in the data centers that knit our communications, in the polymer filaments of spacecraft, in the woven stents that hold arteries open. Every filament, every fiber is another line in the same long story of people who refused to leave the world unbound. In the museum and the factory, in the threadbare relic and the laser loom, that story remains readable. Civilization, at its best, is a fabric of cooperation, warp and weft drawn from countless lives. The miracle is not that we learned to make cloth. It is that we learned to make connection. And so, from a handful of twisted flax in a cave to the shining mesh of fiber optics that circle the planet, the same truth runs straight and unbroken. We survive by weaving.